Hey everyone. So, as I was producing today's episode, I realized that there are a few ideas that I have heavily studied throughout my time in college and just since I turned 18, and they deeply influence the way that I see the world. And I probably need a few episodes like this one to explain to you the idea. And today I'm going to talk to you about securitization. So I'm going to explain what it is, some examples of it, and then I will explain its consequences and why it is important for us to resist it. This is Leftist Law, devoted leftist resistance, delivering the daily knowledge that you need in order to be informed and create change. I'm Ryan. Let's break this down. So there's a couple ways to understand the theory of securitization. There is a more simple way. Some version of this theory has been around for a long time, but I want to first start with a more technical way and trace it to the 2006 Copenhagen School of Theory thesis. They were the first ones to really codify it, put it in writing, and the essential idea, as I understand it, is this. It is that threats do not actually exist on their own. Instead, threats are politically constructed in order to motivate people to think or act, most often act, in a certain way. Using the logic and rhetoric of needing to increase security, individuals can be driven to any number of poor decisions or actions. What exactly does this mean? Obviously, you say threats don't exist on their own, and people are like, what? Like, there are threats, right? Hurricanes are a threat. Yes, but there is a massive difference between something which is itself an actual existential threat, such as hurricanes, and most of the things that we are told are threats, as in precursors to war, so other countries, as in, immigrant bodies, right? More on that in a moment. Via securitization and threat construction, we create the conditions by which actual threats emerge. So let's go back to the Cold War. It's the closest we've been to actual war, an actual massive nuclear war. And the only reason that we actually didn't have a massive nuclear war is because of a man named Stanislav Petrov. And on his submarine, where he worked and he was in charge of Russia's nuclear button, he received an indication that a nuclear missile had been launched, and he was told to launch one in response. And this man ultimately, arguably, saved the world by making the decision not to push the button. Essentially, the more we talked about war, the more we hyped up Russia as something that we were in war with, and vice versa, the more likely it became that the conditions of actual war would emerge. And the only reason we didn't go to actual nuclear war when we were supposed to was a man essentially desecuritized. And securitization does not just operate during wartime. It's about the way that, for example, as I mentioned earlier, the immigrant body is constructed as a threat, even if there's little statistical evidence to back it, right? Donald Trump got elected on this form of threat construction, even if it's not proven that quote unquote gang members are killing more people, or of course Mexicans are rapists or murderers. That logic is one that's easy for people to buy into, and it makes people feel safe to securitize, even though, as ironically we just pointed out, it actually makes them less safe. Here's a few other key examples. The Patriot Act is a really good one. Took away a lot of rights in the name of so-called security, right? We're safer now that the Patriot Act and the NSA is watching over all of us. Didn't actually credibly stop a single terrorist threat, but instead spied on a bunch of people for 14 or 15, or still to this day, probably years. The war in the Middle East is another wonderful example. There's weapons of mass destruction that Dick Cheney probably knew didn't exist. And Blackwater made a bunch of money. Weird how this works, right? But we have to respond. There's an imminent threat, and we must go address the threat. And that is the garnishing of political power. It is essentially how political power is generated, especially by the GOP. Right now, the United States is deployed in more than 150 of the world's 180 countries. And again, this is indicative of security logic, the way in which we are told we need to be ready to respond to any threat at any time. So we must be all over the world with the world's biggest military. And on a more recent scale, the travel ban is an example, and Japanese internment. Entire groups of people can be justified for being put away in the name of security, and it happens every day. The war on drugs, the list goes on. And this is often talked about largely in context of international politics and not very frequently on smaller scales, but I personally think that it explains things on a smaller scale too. Take domestically, the Great Depression. The Great Depression, what triggered it really? There was a number of factors, of course, but the biggest deal was when everyone went and withdrew their money because they thought that there was going to be a crash, and it triggered an actual crash. Again, the logic of security creates the conditions by which actual threats emerge. And on an even smaller than domestic level, I think it also explains interpersonal relationships. Let's take the example of a jealous partner who is certain that their significant other is cheating. When you go through your partner's phone, when you tell your partner, like, hey, I think you're cheating on me all the time, right? You start acting jealous, you start acting angry, you push friends away, any of those behaviors, right? Once more, whether your partner was actually cheating on you or not, you are creating the condition in which your partner probably will cheat on you because your relationship is going to get worse. You are isolating your friends. So not only are you pushing people away, but like now you might actually get cheated on, right? Because you are so unpleasant to be around, your partner doesn't want to be around you. We use that to say securitization then is a self-fulfilling prophecy. That the more you think about these things, talk about them, the more you really create them. Because again, the threats do not exist on their own. Ultimately, what you should take out of this is that securitization is extremely regressive, and there is no way to achieve anything like perfect security, and we should not try. Because for that matter, there's not even enough security, right? When are we safe enough? Never, right? The entire GOP could not exist if people would just embrace the level of security that they have in the status quo, but instead they're always afraid of something. It doesn't matter how good things are. They're afraid of the immigrant body. They need a bigger military, even if ours is 10 times bigger than the next, 8 combined. It doesn't matter because we're never safe enough in the eyes of people who buy into security logic, which is most Americans. Now, you can get some of the ideas, the impact that this type of rhetoric has from what I've isolated before, but it goes even deeper than this because security logic, in order for it to prosper, to exist, it requires an infinite enemy. There has to always be an other. There is a core to protect and everything that exists outside of it, a periphery. And that periphery is relegated to destruction. It is us to protect versus them who wants to hurt us, them who wants to take from us. And this is why Trump's rhetoric, the Patriot Act, etc., cause massive increases in violence against Muslims, even Muslim Americans who lived there their entire lives. This means that the way that the state talks about things directly impacts the way that our citizenry thinks about them. So when a threat is constructed, we respond to it, not just by voting, but also white supremacist groups increase. Even people who aren't white supremacists are skeptical of and driven towards violence against Muslim individuals because they think that they're a threat. This theory even probably explains, in some parts, racism, in hand with reproductive futurism, which is something I'll talk about on a later episode. But consider that the KKK frequently describes bodies of color as a threat to the existence of white futurity, or that queer people used to be described as a threat to the future of the human race as a whole, right? People would say, if everyone was gay, then how would we continue to have kids? Where would the future go? Once you recognize securitization, you will see it literally everywhere. It is the core of politics, in particular conservative politics, and frankly negative relationships as a whole. So we have some idea of what securitization is and that it causes these really negative, a huge host of negative impacts, right? So how do we beat securitization? Well, the best way to resist is to desecuritize. You might remember the guy we named earlier, Stanislav Petrov. That person, an excellent example of what desecuritization looks like. It is even when you think the people around you, the rhetoric around you has constructed that the enemy here is a threat, the threat is real, and they are going to strike on us, strike first, right? Realism, first strike logic, it's pivotal. Realism is built upon the logic of security. Uh, Taking yourself out of that de-escalates the conflict massively. Security is a two-sided endeavor, right? It takes two to tango. You don't have a Cold War without an angry Russia or without an angry United States. If one of them just says, you know what, like throws their hands up, we aren't worried about it, then we're looking at an entirely different world, a cooperative world, frankly. And desecuritizing could also be thought of as simply embracing vulnerability. Again, there's no such thing as perfect security. You're never going to be safe enough. And in fact, embracing vulnerability makes you, I would argue, more powerful in the first place. Let's take that interpersonal example again, where you think your partner's cheating on you. Well, by not caring about it, you make yourself a lot stronger. One, probably a lot less likely to be cheated on because you're not gonna, again, take the steps that create it. But what's more than that, you put yourself in a place where that can't harm you in the first place. Like, yes, that makes me upset. Of course it makes you upset. But instead of becoming angry, instead of lashing out, reacting to it, you can embrace that it may be real. And even if it becomes real, then, you separate yourself from it. And that's all there is to it. You don't need to take more extreme steps, lash out, become angry. And I think that is like desecuritizing in personal relationships and recognizing security logic when it does come up in domestic discussions and international discussions, and rejecting it is huge. It is extremely difficult. Vulnerability is not an easy position to embrace. I still struggle with desecuritizing in my personal life. I really used to struggle with it before, but it is the steps we need to frankly resolve a lot of conflict in the world. And if more people could desecuritize, we would be looking at a world which was entirely different than the one that we're looking at now. So I urge you to take this, do what you can with it, spread the word about it, recognize it, call it out, tell people, and make the world a better place through desecuritizing a day at a time. If you liked what you saw, please subscribe and click on some other videos. And I really hope that we can continue to bring you the education that you need to change the world. Thank you.